is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Randall Mauldin with Supply Leaders Academy, and I appreciate your being here today at noon, taking time out of your busy day to join us to learn more about the secrets of getting high profits and more value from your RFP systems. Now, the reason we're here today is, like we say, there's lots of folks out there trying to dig into your profits. You got lots of vendors that you're interacting with. And as business owners, as procurement professionals, as people responsible for the supply chain in many different aspects, we're there to protect our profits. And, it could be not only vendors, but we have competition and the economy as well. And the opportunity you have here is that realize that, supply chains are not optimized. You hear that more and more, that whenever there's an issue with a company or with the economy, the first place they go to is their supply chain. Where am I spending money? How am I spending money? And what do I need to do to reduce that cost? A lot of organizations are supply chain introverts, meaning they don't think about supply chain till it's too late. And that means that once they start looking at their expenses, they start to realize some valuable things, which I'll show you in the next slide, which are very interesting. But the other thing I want to point out is that, supply chain improvements are not incentivized, meaning people go out and they just say they expect cost savings. It's just something that they should get to. And one of the benefits of supply chain values is that whatever you save immediately goes to the bottom line. That increases your profits. And the one other tool we want to talk about is that technology is just a tool, not a solution. You got to have the people that understand how to use the tool, how to use it wisely, so that you can make more money for your business. And why is this important? Is that if you save 2.5% in saving or in cost, then it's equal to 10% profit, the amount of profit that you would earn, 10% increase in sales. That businesses that use supply chain management are 73% profitable than businesses that don't. And you can expect to see a 40% ROI, return on your investment, when you implement supply chain management. Now, today I've got a special guest, Mr. David Wadler. He's here. He is the CEO of Vendorful, and he has great experience using RFPs and developing systems for RFPs. He has a great background, so I'm not going to try and tell you what he's done in his life. I'm going to just turn it over there. So, hey, David, how are you doing today?
I am excellent, and enjoying the snow here in New York on the second day of spring.
Oh, my goodness. Must be cold. I'm down here in Florida, so I get to watch it on the news. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I am a software guy by training, and actually, sort of had my first exposure to the supply chain from the other side. So I had another business that I started. It was an online video platform, and we would power the video for media companies, enterprises. And, in the course of doing business, I remember actually quite vividly getting my first RFP, being super excited. We were finalists. Didn't win the business, but just being part of the game was so exciting. By the time I got to RFP number 5, I said, it's a 3-letter acronym that should be a 4-letter word. It was a painful, arduous process. The good fortune of leading that business through acquisition. We were acquired by a large public company. And day one, literally, was asked to review some contracts, found out that there was a ton of leakage, and was basically asked to get involved in some of the IT sourcing. And from my perspective, whatever complaints I had about responding to RFPs were dwarfed by the challenges of issuing them. And the rationale for starting this business, to facilitate sourcing events, etc., really was born from that experience. I have nothing but empathy now for the people on this webinar who have to wrangle, not just vendors, but stakeholders, and not just people, but data, and pulling all of this together in a coherent way, doing it efficiently and effectively is a real challenge. And, if it costs you, $25,000 in person hours to run an RFP for something that's, $150,000, you're already upside down from an ROI perspective. So we figured we'd make tools to make people more effective. But Randy, to your point, tools aren't a replacement for people. They have to know what they're doing in order to get the full value out of the tool.
David, that's why you and I got together and realized an opportunity we had, because that's what I do. I bring the people part of this and train those people. Yeah, having done this since 2010 after coming out of the Marine Corps, and training people to be certified in supply chain management through the Institute for Supply Management, making a difference in their careers. But what was really interesting about this particular business for me and starting this business was that everything we taught was applicable. People were immediately realizing major cost savings by applying these concepts. And one of the major frustrations of all the folks that we talked to was the tools, or were the tools that they had to use. They were so complicated, complex, and the tools ended up taking more time than the work they actually had to do. So when we started talking about different things, we just saw that there was an opportunity today was to talk about RFPs as a concept, and then also RFPs as a tools, your experience, not just as a developer, but your actual experience using those RFPs. And folks, just to kind of share with you how we're going to do this today is we're just going to go kind of a back and forth conversation between David and I and ask questions. But before we do that, I want to share with you how to interact with us. Okay, so how we're going to interact with us is that what you're going to do is that over here on the side, you should see where you can ask questions. There's a place in there you can ask questions. Just go ahead and type in there your questions at any time. We'll see those and respond to those either as we're talking or at the very end. We'll make sure everyone's questions are asked and answered right here today. So, feel free again to just ask questions as you see them. And that way we can do that. Okay. So with that, David, why don't we go ahead and kick it off? And we got together, kind of came up with some questions to help guide our conversation, but we'll just kind of let the conversation go wherever it may lead us today. So here you go, Dave. Why don't we go ahead and set the context with your asking me some questions?
Sure. So, and for everyone to know, we agreed on the questions, but we've not discussed the questions. So I'm going to be learning from Randy as you guys do in real time. So the question here really speaks to, when we, talk to organizations, procurement departments, et cetera, I think oftentimes there is maybe a disproportionate emphasis on hard savings. Hard savings are absolutely important, right? I mean, you don't want to pay more than you have to, but there is a strategic element to sourcing. And I think that's value. And my question is, how do you really, identify and delineate, right, the distinction between just pure kind of hard cost savings and value maximization?
Yeah, Dave, that's a great question. And that a lot of companies, they immediately go for the savings, the hard dollars, and they don't really realize the total cost of ownership. And that's when you start to bring in RFPs. You look at things in its entirety, the whole picture, not just the cost, the price you're paying today, but you look at the price, this money you're spending to get into the RFP. The RFP itself, then actually purchasing whatever it is you're buying, and then operating and maintaining it, and then ultimately disposing of it. All of these factors are things that you can include in your RFP, so you can evaluate the vendors, comparing apples to apples. So if one vendor is saying we can save you more money, but then they are giving you horrible shipping terms, meaning they're making you charge that for that, versus someone else saying, hey, we're going to include everything, and there's just a little bit of a price difference, you may not see that unless you point that out in your RFP and your evaluation process. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think there's another component, if we can kind of make me think of something else. The other idea is sort of, I'd like you to opine on, is sort of the idea of aligning your suppliers with your interests, and sort of, you might end up in some cases paying more upfront and saving down the road. And so, the idea is that, I guess the hard dollar cost savings might be deferred. I'm just curious if you can speak to maybe vendor alignment specifically and how that plays into the value calculation.
It's vendor alignment is actually one of the things we talk about in our training when we talk about vendor rationalization. And what this is we're looking for the best vendors for our company. And that's when you look at your supply chain from a strategic perspective and say, is this a long-term partnership or is this more of a short-term buy? And what we're doing here is we're aligning with suppliers so that when we do an RFP, we know the suppliers we're using are the best of the best for what we need. And when you lay out the details, you lay out your instructions, and you qualify your vendors, saying we want vendors of this caliber, of this size, of this experience, then when you actually award a contract, you know you're getting the total value. But all this is driven by your requirements from your customers. So if your customers, meaning your internal customers who are focused on your external customers, it's what are they looking for? What do they need? Is it reliability? Is it high quality products? Because everything costs in the end. So first is understanding what your requirements are, where you're headed with your supply chain, and then looking at your vendors to see which are the best vendors to support that process. Does that help?
Perfect. Thank you. So this one speaks to, we've had conversations, and you alluded to this earlier. There is an ROI metric for sourcing. It's much easier for a salesperson to say, look, I went out and I closed $1 million in new business. We have clarity right away into the margin, into the value that provides. What do you suggest procurement professionals do in terms of understanding and then delivering the metrics so they can understand how effective they're being and then report that sort of up the chain of command?
Yeah, that's something we wrestle with a lot when we're going through our training, and that, where our procurement professionals are like, how do I demonstrate my value to the organization that I'm working for? One that always leaps to mind for everyone is cost savings. That's one of the major metrics that procurement professionals are evaluated on, is how much money have you saved me today? And I like to say we're going to change that conversation from cost savings to profit generation, because when I save you money, that puts profit to the bottom line. And that's what the ultimate goal is for procurement professionals, equals profits. And then a couple of other metrics to look at are how long does it take to do your RFP? Because time is money. And if you have something that you can get done right now versus something you can wait to vet out your vendors a little bit longer, that's going to be something you're looking at. But that's going to be an ultimate metric, because if you take your RFP and at first it takes you 30 days and you want to get it to less time, well, how do you know how long? Why is it taking you 30 days? That's where you start to look at your systems, your process, how long each step in the process is actually taking, how much is it costing you. And you look at those things as well. So the cost savings, time to complete the RFP, and then you do your vendor surveys, where after you've awarded the contract, you look at your vendors and say, how good a job is that vendor doing? Are they meeting my quality standards? Are they meeting my on-time delivery standards? Are they complying with the terms of the contract? So those are other metrics that you're going to look at from a procurement professional's point of view. And then the one that eludes a lot of people is the cost avoidance metric. This is the metric that when the end of the year comes and the vendor comes to you and says, hey, we're going to have to increase our prices by 10%. And then you actually negotiate that to not increasing it 10%, maybe even lowering the cost by either with that vendor or going to another vendor. That's savings that is actually achieved, but it's not hard. It's hard to see because it's not defined. I paid $1, now I'm paying 90 cents. Or I paid $1 and they wanted to increase it to $1.10, but I kept it down to $1. So that 10-cent increase is actually hard savings. It's just it was negotiated out versus actually reduced from one contract to another. Is that helpful?
Absolutely, and I think that actually leads us nicely into the next question. So the thinking here was, and again, I like to come back to sales as sort of the analog here, because at the end of the day, right, sales success drifts to the bottom line, procurement success drifts to the bottom line. The difference is that, unless a company is operating at, close to 100% gross margin, for every dollar you generate in new sales, a lot of that gets eaten away, right, by cost. Whereas On the other side, right, any dollars that you generate, you said I think 73% of savings, fall to the bottom line. That's much higher than in sales. So it's interesting to me that maybe I'm answering my own question, but if you look at sort of the world of sales ops, you would never go to a sales organization and say, you know what, you guys don't need a CRM, just stick everything in Excel, you'll be okay. And then, why are we doing it? We don't feel it's worth investing in the right tools for a sales organization. That doesn't happen, but that happens all the time in procurement. The number one competitor we have in the market is not necessarily a giant monolithic enterprise software company. There are those, but more often than not, we're finding people are using email and Excel and Word and PDFs to run their RFPs. So my question is, roundabout way of going, like, what do we do? Who do we talk to in an organization, if you're in procurement, to get budget so you can make the right investment? And once you have the metrics, you should be able to rationalize the initial investment, but then also show the specific return on investment.
That's, again, another way to demonstrate the value of a procurement professional, and it's a very simple answer, believe it or not. Procurement equals profits, period. At the end of the day, sales generates revenues, but every sale equals revenue equals expenses. But at the end of the day, every business is measured on profitability and the ability to spend whatever revenue they're generating, either through sales or if they're taking on investors, they have to demonstrate how they're spending that money with investors. That comes down to the procurement professional choosing which vendors are actually giving them the best value for every single dollar spent. Sales folks can, and don't get me wrong, you can't have procurement without sales, right? You got to have sales, you got to have revenue. But when at the end of the day, procurement equals profits, period. I just wanted to just keep it simple. And so when you talk to a CFO or a COO and they're kind of figuring out, well, what do we got to do? Why would I invest in my supply chain? Why would I take the time to make sure my supply chain is at the highest peak of performance anywhere along the supply chain, not just my vendors, but even my own staff? How do I know they're doing the right job? It's because at the end of the day, the CFO, profits. The COO, the operations guy, he has the right stuff in the right place at the right time to get the job done. And you can't do that. You can't do that. My background being in the military for 20 years, that's what it came down to. If I don't have my stuff, I can't execute this plan. So it came down to logistics and supply chain to enable them to achieve the great things that they had to do. And you can look back in history, every great military campaign would not have even been possible if they didn't have the people to do it and the stuff to get things done. So that's what I would answer it to sum it up quickly and in a few words, procurement equals profits, period. Does that make sense?
That's awesome. And I'm gonna liberate that line from you when I talk to people in the future. It's a pithy and accurate assessment.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things we found, particularly in larger companies, is just how high, or maybe another way of looking at it, low the threshold is for a bid waiver. We're talking to companies that, in some cases, large enterprises, there is no requirement to go to a sourcing event if the purchase in question is lower than many hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I can understand, right, avoiding an RFP if you're gonna, if you're looking at a $5,000 or $10,000 purchase, and could certainly go higher than that, depends on the cost of running the RFP. But if you're looking at $300,000, I don't understand how you can rationalize avoiding the RFP as a matter of course. But then in some cases, we're seeing people can go out and request bid waivers for things, up to $1 million. When is it appropriate to get a bid waiver? Is it just tied to cost?
No, I would. When I was looking at this question, I was kind of, it makes sense what you described common practice. Many companies have a dollar threshold that requires an RFP. Some as low as $5,000. Anything over $5,000 requires them to get at least 3 bids or quotes. and anything above 100,000 requires a public RFP where they actually advertise to vendors and to participate in this requirement. What I would offer is, if it does depend upon cost, dollar is easy to look at. I mean, if you're spending over, $10,000, in my world, some of the richest people I've talked to, they said $1,000 is a lot of money. So they would say, we got to do an RFP for $1,000. Now, if when you're doing a corporation, you have a lot of bids, every $1,000, you would put a little bit of, a context around that. Say it needs to be a little bit higher because we just don't have time to do that. But if you have the dollar value, the more money you're spending, the more savings you're going to generate through an RFP. So if you're spending $100,000 and you can expect to save at least 10% on just by doing an RFP, and we'll talk about some examples of when somebody implemented an RFP, how much they saved. Just think about that. It's $100,000. If I can save 10%, that's $10,000. That's $10,000 more in profit. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, then the numbers get really, really interesting. But the other thing to look at, if you're having a lot of small bids, a lot of small purchases, that's an opportunity to what we call aggregate spend. You can put a lot of small purchase orders under one vendor and then do an RFP for vendors to provide those things. And then you're dealing with one vendor versus 20 or 30. And that gives you not only aggregation of product so you can purchase on volume of scale, but it also reduces the time required to do a competition or to do an RFP, because you've already basically done the competition. You said, okay, which vendors are going to provide this basket of goods? Give me your best pricing. Give me your best value adds. Give me your best quality. Okay, now that goes into a contract, and then you can work with one vendor to maximize that relationship versus relearning the relationship every single time. So for those smaller purchases, you just wrap them up into a larger contract that goes for 12 months versus 1 month. Does that make sense?
It does. And I also think it's interesting because it speaks to something that I think runs contrary to popular belief from people who work outside of procurement. My experience is a lot of people feel like procurement departments, their role is to beat up vendors. And what you're actually talking to is basically building a relationship with a vendor, right? And maximizing the value of that relationship, which is very, very different than I think what's commonly perceived, but absolutely a critical part of the procurement process.
And you mentioned relationship, and vendor relationships are most important when things are going wrong, not when things are right. I mean, consider the weather you're in right now. There's some vendors, for their best customers, they're bending over backwards to get in that weather to deliver on time as promised. For some customers where they don't have that strong relationship, they're like, I'm sorry, the weather's bad. I'm not going to be able to get to you today. So that relationship is something worth investing in, because that you're going to need it when you need it most. So that, and how you do that is developing these long-term relationships for folks. And it makes a difference. It definitely makes a difference.
Great. So I'm going to confess to being guilty here. I have been a stakeholder in an RFP run by a sourcing person where I've been busy, and I get lots and lots of emails, and I have a level of subject matter expertise, etc. But I have another job, right? Sourcing isn't my responsibility. But my responsibilities ultimately, in some respects, hinge on the effectiveness of the sourcing effort. So if I'm the person who is actually running the event, running the sourcing event, what should I do to make sure that the people like me, right, the stakeholders, are engaged appropriately, that I'm benefiting from their level of expertise and their input and establishing requirements without, on the other hand, being too burdensome?
There's kind of two questions in there. Is one, if I'm a stakeholder, how do I leverage procurement? And then if I'm a procurement professional, how do I get the most from my stakeholders? So we'll start with the first question. Stakeholders commonly try to do it themselves. And that means they're an expert in what they do, whether they're an engineer, an operator, a manager, whatever it is, they are an expert in what they do. And they require stuff to get what they do done. And then they start to call vendors, they start to try and make deals because they're learning what's available, and they just don't even call procurement until they're ready to cut a contract. And that's when procurement stands up and says, well, had you engaged us earlier, we could have reduced your cost significantly. So one, as stakeholders, realize that there is a valuable part of your team, the procurement professional, that knows how to do this stuff well, just like you know how to do whatever it is you do well. That would be one. And then as a procurement professional, when it comes to engaging the stakeholders, it's really just about communication, constant, consistent communication, asking them, what do you need? And this is where the procurement professionals need to step up to be proactive and not reactive, to be outside and off of their desk talking to people, and then being involved in collaboration using different systems and different tools so that you have constant interaction with your stakeholders, because it starts with a clear requirement. Stakeholder, what do you need? What is your requirement? Clearly, and really diving in and drilling into that. Once you have a clear requirement, is outlining expectations. This is going to take time. I'm going to require time to do the RFP, to do the advertising, to evaluate the proposals, to award the contract, and ultimately give you the stuff that you need. So you have clear expectations. It's going to take 10 days, 15 days, 30 days, whatever that is. That way the stakeholders have clear expectations. And then after that, communicate. Have them involved in the evaluation. First, have them involved in the requirements generation. Have them sign off on that requirement and make sure they understand that they need to do that part. The next is to have them involved in flushing that requirement out and being involved in the evaluation of the vendors. So when we actually select a vendor, they're getting what they want. They're getting what they've expected. They're moving forward in that process, and ultimately they're going to be happy with that procurement. Where I've experienced frustration is the stakeholders, they want it yesterday because they didn't plan properly, and now it's procurement's fault. Well, if you told me yesterday, I could have had it to you today, but you told me this morning and now you want it yesterday. That's going to be almost impossible unless I have a strong relationship with the vendor, which we alluded to a little bit earlier in our discussion. So clear expectations, clear requirements, and then communicate proactively, not reactively, with your stakeholders. That way they don't feel that they're forgotten, and if something's going wrong, something's not coming out the way you said it would, be proactive to say, Mr. Stakeholder, Mrs. Stakeholder, hey, you know what, we said it was going to be delivered this Friday. The vendor called me today. It's not going to be delivered this Friday. It's going to be Monday first thing. Is that okay? Just want to let you know. They may be already off for the weekend, but they're going to say he's engaged, she knows what she's doing, she's got a clear idea of what's going on, and ultimately we're going to have what we need to get the job done. When they don't know and they find out because it didn't show up, that's when they get frustrated, and then our credibility as procurement professionals starts to deteriorate step by step, and that's not good either. That's not good at all. That's what we don't want to do. We want to make sure that as professionals we are doing the right things for the right reason. Does that make sense?
Definitely. So this one probably would have been a different question had we, caught each other at a different time. We recently filled out and completed an RFP. It was over 700 questions. Probably under 10% of the questions that we answered will actually inform the buyer in terms of making a smart decision. So, the question is really, how do you, as a sourcing professional, figure out the best way to get, work with the stakeholders, as you just discussed, to understand the criteria, but to make sure that the information you're getting from the vendors is actionable?
As we mentioned earlier, it starts with a requirement, and then you have a clear requirement with your instructions in your RFP that you send to the vendors so they answer the questions you want them to answer and that you need. What we don't want to confuse is qualifying a vendor with executing an RFP. Qualifying the vendor should be done before you ever even start the RFP. You should be doing that consistently on a regular basis, either annually or however often you're looking at a category, is qualify the best vendors for that category. That's how you learn which vendors, so that when you submit an RFP, you can really focus on the requirement, not qualifying vendors to say, hey, are you the right business for us? That was done before we started the RFP. That allows you to execute RFPs faster, more efficiently, with the right people so that we're executing the right things to make a difference. So that's how you're getting actionable information, because you're only asking for information you need to make a decision, not to qualify somebody. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that was the challenge. First of all, there were far too many qualifying questions. I don't know if they needed 600 some odd questions for qualifying, but separately, I think you're right. Splitting those into two processes. We often recommend people run an RFI in advance of running an RFP. The RFI being appreciably smaller and more compact and going out to a wider audience. People that vendors that fall below the line do not get invited to the next round. And so I think that's it's as if we had a mind meld.
Right. And that's where the procurement professionals listening are going to talk about time to do things. And this is a strategic focus instead of a tactical focus. And when we get strategic, we only want to work with the best vendors. We'll take the time to do that appropriately by qualifying our vendors. Where if we're tactical all the time, that's when we're always putting out fires, being constantly reactive. And instead, we qualify our vendors, then we have the best of the best vendors working for us that we need, and then we do RFPs step by step, and we execute faster and more efficiently.
So this is an interesting one. When we talked about stakeholders, oftentimes being the subject matter experts in a particular area, procurement department is the experts on running through purchasing, vendor relations, all the evaluation, and sort of the union of those two skill sets creates a great sourcing event. What do you do in an area where, let's say, you're a large company, you're going to buy an ERP system for the first time. You don't have anybody necessarily on staff who's an ERP expert. You've had people who have experience using ERPs, but not somebody who has a really holistic understanding of how to do it. And you don't necessarily have a category manager in procurement who has that expertise either. What do you recommend when you're kind of working in a bit of an information vacuum?
That's a lot of procurement professionals are not the experts in what they do, but they know how to talk to experts and get that. And you kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier. You start with an RFI, what's available in the market, and what questions do I need to ask? But that's when you kind of start to dig in that area of the vendors telling you what that's available because they want to sell you specifically what they want to sell you, versus having true expertise in an area to know what is good information and what is marketing information. So where do you get the expertise is you build it through a process. You have RFIs and RFPs where you're building information. And the other thing is to start to look for people who can manage categories. And that's one of the things we're doing in this new program we have that we're developing, is building this capability in individuals who may be an expert in RFP systems, for example, and then they have the ability to take that expertise and apply it to multiple companies, and they bring them in and bring them out based on the needs of that company. But that's something we're building and looking at doing, and it's one of the reasons we're doing this program is to start to build this expertise. Because just imagine some of the programs that we're going to get ready to tap into, had you had an expert that you could go to and talk to and have them show you the right things, the right questions to ask, the right vendors, where to go find these vendors, who are the best of the best, then how much time it would have saved you and how much more money would have saved you because you've been asking better questions, more efficient questions. Does that make sense? You got to use a process one and then go find the people to build out that process for you.
Perfect. And I like the idea of having sort of a marketplace of experts that you can kind of tap on demand. I think it would be super helpful.
And this kind of leads us into our next category. Really, now I get to interview you, so this is going to be fun. So what we've done up to this point is we kind of spelled out the context of RFPs, why they're valuable, how to use them, some of the pieces and parts of it. But now, I get to interview a user, someone who's actually done RFPs. So David, why don't you, if you could, you and I've talked about it, but share with the audience here, when did you first experience RFPs?
So yeah, my first experience with RFPs is really on the vendor side, and I got to see good ones and I got to see bad ones. And after you get a few of them, it becomes pretty easy, to tell the difference. And I think I was never so articulate as you were, but I think one of the fatal flaws, now that I think through this, my history of responding to these things, is the commingling of qualification and selection. Those should be distinct and separate processes, and not only are you making life worse for the vendors, making life worse for yourself, right? As a sourcing professional, because the scope of the criteria you have to evaluate across a larger number of vendors is substantially increased. So my first time was being a vendor, and last few years before starting this, I got to live on the other side and learn a ton.
What were some of the problems you saw during that first RFP experience as a vendor? I mean, what did we talked about commingling requirements and qualification. What were some of the other frustrations you felt from an RFP?
I would say that one of the other things, and certainly I've had vendors now tell me this quite directly in my current role, is oftentimes you would see RFPs that were clearly written by one of your competitors. And there is an information asymmetry between buyer and seller. Even if you have a subject matter expert in-house, the vendors, all they do is one thing, right? They sell their product. They're one or two products all day long, every day. And so they know their product, they know the space, they have a tremendous degree of expertise. So obviously it behooves them to write RFP templates and to provide them with and provide them to buyers. Now, when you were the vendor who did not provide the template, and you see all sorts of questions, you can oftentimes deduce whose template it is, because there are they're written in such a way as to allow the vendor who wrote it to put its best foot forward. And there might be a feature or set of features in there that are specific and unique to that vendor that may be irrelevant to the buyer. But if the buyer adopts the template wholeheartedly, all the other vendors are basically now playing on a tilted playing field. And so that to me is probably the most frustrating thing. And then the other frustrating thing would be sort of the length of an RFP. And I have no problem with a long RFP as long as the questions are good and actionable. But when they're huge and you're going through it and you can see that answering that question is going to get the buyer no closer to making a decision, but it's maybe a CYA question, or I don't know better question, or I'm qualifying while I'm selecting question. Those are incredibly frustrating.
And I've participated in them as well as a vendor, and you've highlighted several of the main frustrations from a vendor's point of view. And for the procurement professionals on listening in, it's kind of like, well, why do I care? I'm a procurement professional. I'm not worried about the vendor. It boils down to your time. Is that you want to be more efficient, more effective in the questions you're asking. So you want to make the RFP experience for good vendors, because then good vendors will want to participate in your RFIs and your RFPs. So, understanding what the problems your vendors are experiencing help you create the solutions in your process to get more value from this. Now, this was the experiences we've just talked about were as a vendor, but then your story before, when you were acquired, then you became a user of RFPs. You were brought in on certain things, and I remember the story you were sharing with me. I was hoping you'd share it today about when you were asked to participate in a sourcing event, how that experience kind of played out, and how that really demonstrated to you the value of the RFP process. If you don't mind sharing that with folks.
Sure. Yeah, one good one and one bad one. I'll start with the bad one because it's sort of the mirror image of the thing I just described. I was involved in a sourcing event. I happened to have a lot of expertise in the subject area, and therefore had a lot of relationships with vendors in the industry. So a company asked me to bring in a bunch of these vendors. I think I brought in 3 or 4 of them out of about 8 that were being evaluated. And subsequently recused myself from the process, right? I wanted to be a high integrity, honest process, and I didn't feel I had skin in the game. I had relationships with these people. I wanted to make sure that there was no question that the process was done the right way. Fast forward to when I left to start my own company, I meet with the CEO of a company that won. We had coffee together, and he said, "Oh, let me tell you how this thing played out." Called me up. We did demo. Demo went well. They called me up a couple of weeks later. They said, "Hey, we'd love for you to participate in the RFP. We'll be in touch in 10 to 12 weeks." I said, "Why 10 to 12 weeks?" I said, "Well, we got to write an RFP." I said, "Why don't I give you an RFP?" Sent them the RFP. Not only did he win, a la the vendor written RFP that I referenced, he ended up overcharging them, and he didn't want to overcharge them. And he told me, I expected them to remove the questions that were irrelevant. They didn't. They sent it back completely intact. And so he ended up having to basically sell them features that they didn't need. So that was a bad RFP experience. The other one was a good RFP experience. When I went in, we were, I was asked to review a contract. We didn't have a ton of leverage because we had 3 contracts with one vendor, 2 of which were coterminous, the other one wasn't, and the one was expiring soon. And reached out to the vendor. I said, "Look, we're paying 7x market value, blah, blah, blah. It's not good. I realize we're locked in, but we're going to run an RFP at least for this one that's expiring." We couldn't just breach the other 2 agreements that ran for an additional year. But the very process of running the RFP allowed us to negotiate an existing contract down by 50%. And so we saved, from the current to the existing price and the updated pricing, close to $1 million. And that was simply by putting it out to bid. Even though we didn't have much leverage, and they knew to some extent that we didn't have much leverage, that was the power of the RFP. Now, in a situation where we had 3 contracts that were expiring, I expect that the savings would have been even more pronounced. But simply by going through the effort, prices basically fell dramatically.
We actually answered the next couple of questions just through your shared experience. The problems that we had with RFPs and the success from the RFP process, which here was the number. That's the most important piece, that they saved over $1 million with the I don't want to use the word threat, but the threat of an RFP with a vendor. Like if you were going to do an RFP and the vendor just immediately said, "I don't want to go through that process, so I'm going to reduce your cost immediately." Just imagine if there was now competition involved in that. And that's what you were talking about with the 3 expiring contracts later, bringing in that competition, how much more savings there could have been. Now, what were some of the challenges you're seeing with the current RFP systems? And this is where we start to mingle. When I say systems, I mean not only technology, but also processes that, that kind of created the situation you explained before, where they just introduce an RFP. Somebody says, we're gonna save you money. You think that's a lack of understanding procurement as a capability versus as a process? What are some of your thoughts on that? How is this kind of starting to come together, where you're having people issues and tool issues, and it's costing companies hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars just because they don't know any better? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's people, process, and systems, right? Those are the 3 things. And I think to some extent, if you have the right system, you can we'll call it systematized process, and almost make a lot of not all the issues, but make a lot of those issues around process go away. Earlier on, you were talking about, communicate. If you look at RFP, again, people are busy and they have conflicting things. You might have somebody in your procurement department who's running 4 or 5 events, and it's hard for that person to stay, in touch with everybody, and incredibly burdensome to do this with email. You have stakeholders who have their day jobs. They need the good or service that's going to be sourced. And they have a massive vested interest in it, but they also kind of have to keep the trains running on time, right? So I think the biggest challenges, I think, are around communication and data. And communication is too hard and data is too hard. And they're hard really for the same reason, is that the tooling that exists is not purpose built for this process, right? So what do we use to communicate for RFPs? We use email, we use chat, we use, in some cases, we use the U.S. Postal Service. And so you have this, kind of disconnected stuff. And from a data perspective, we're often, shoving things into Word documents or Excel documents. You think about, when you run an RFP and you do this, what we call the old-fashioned way with Word and Excel. And, you have, let's say, a 100-question RFP. You have 8 vendors. That means you have 800 responses. Each vendor gives you 5 attachments for those responses. And now you have 40 attachments, and you have to figure out, which of those attachments goes to which of the 800 responses. That I call data metastasis, right? It's just, it spreads everywhere, and doing these sorts of apples to apples comparisons become very hard. So what happens is process falls down. And so people might have the best training, the best of intentions, right? You might have systems, Excel and Word and email are all, really, really powerful systems. But to kind of tie these things together coherently, I think is what's missing. And there are tools out there. Again, there are procurement platforms. Most of them have gotten a bit long in the tooth, frankly. And when we looked at them, they look like they would have been, state of the art and transformational, at the turn of the century. And it certainly might be better than email in some cases. Some cases, maybe not. But the two challenges we saw there were A, they hadn't evolved, and B, they were often monolithic, enterprise systems. And if you're going to have to spend millions of dollars to start using them, that becomes very challenging to rationalize for, oftentimes underfunded procurement departments. That's what we identify as the main challenges. The main challenges, frankly, are the reasons that we decided to start this business, right? We thought there was a lot of space to come in and provide value.
You described a lot of the challenges we hear in our training. We've trained thousands of people in the certification process to be certified in this profession. So, and from small startup companies to Fortune 50 companies have gone through our training, and the consistent complaint of systems is too complex, takes too much time, and I get overwhelmed. So I immediately go back to email and spreadsheets. This is where it starts to put in the description you had earlier. The challenges is, the seller was in charge of the RFP by providing the template to the RFP. And the systems you're describing today and the problems we're solving is that the buyers start to get in control of the process instead of just giving it to the sellers to solve for it. So how do you feel about, buyers being in control of the RFP versus the seller? Is that really where we want to go? Is it possible with the tools we have right now to do RFPs efficiently in a way to allow buyers more time to do better procurement? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, our thesis is that buyers dictate venue, right? So if I'm selling something and the buyer wants me to send, my response back in smoke signals, if the deal is large enough, I will probably do it. Right? Telegraph, you name it. Buyers, should not just, dictate the venue, but dictate, the flow of information, the process, et cetera. One of the other things, we run into that's frustrating in talking to people that they find frustrating is even when you ask information, if you don't ask the question, this is not something necessarily a system can fix, right? This is about training. You need to be very specific. If you ask the price for something, specify the currency, right? If you want the cost, per unit, specify the unit type. Otherwise, somebody's going to give you inches, somebody's going to get you centimeters, somebody's going to get you euros, somebody's going to get you yen or dollars. And so the buyers really have an obligation, I think, to control the process. Now, while sellers might play ball with smoke signals and telegraphs, et cetera, you do, as a buyer, want to give the seller, a pretty good experience. Excel is an okay experience for a seller. It's not great for collaboration. There's a lot of copying and pasting that has to go on. It's not great for managing attachments, but everybody has it. It's usable, etc. But I do think that the buyer has a responsibility, primarily to itself, to run the process, and in so doing, though, should probably try to make this process as good for sellers as possible, if for no other reason than the point you raised earlier, and you want people to participate. You don't want people to look at this RFP and say, oh, you know what, it's not worth it. And if the venue or the tooling or what have you, or the size isn't appropriate, or the kinds of questions don't make sense, people are going to opt out. And then you've done a lot of work, for nothing. If you get one respondent, that's not going to be super helpful for you.
I think that's a good point. You have to have participation for an RFP to be effective. You got to have at least 3 vendors that are willing to participate in your RFP to ensure you have what we call reasonableness, price reasonableness, by having 3 different quotes or 3 different people giving you some idea of what it might cost us. And then you also have better solutions, right? So now you can look at 3 different solutions and then evaluate which one is really going to solve your problem versus one person who's given you the RFP template and said, these are your problems and this is your solution. And then you have another vendor who can't even meet that. Well, that's because one of your vendors told you what the problems were based on their solution, not necessarily your problems, which is interesting. And I agree, the buyers should control the sellers, but I also see the challenges with the buyers because their systems are so complex and take such a long time. Their processes are not even defined to where every single RFP is a new venture in itself. So, considering different tools and things that you've looked at, because you've not only been a vendor participating in RFPs, but you've also been a buyer driving the RFP process. What are some of the key features that you see in an RFP tool from a buyer's point of view? What do you see that should be in a system? What are you looking for?
So I would say I look for a bunch of things. I'd say probably the number one most important thing is a repeatable best practices process. And this means that you just said every RFP, right, is a new venture, and you're sort of reinventing the wheel every time slightly differently. And the problem is when you lack consistency, not only are you creating time, right? We're wasting time. You can never create time. Unfortunately, you can only waste it. Yeah, so you're not only are you increasing the amount of time, I should say, that takes, which is bad from an ROI perspective. The lack of sort of a systematized process also undermines your efforts in terms of savings, vendor alignment, et cetera. So number one, I think, is to have a repeatable best practices process. Number 2, I think, is around collaboration, making sure that you can engage the right people and in the right ways. You don't want to overburden your stakeholders. You also don't want to cut them out of the loop. There's some people who might be involved in drafting. There are other people who are going to be involved in evaluation. There are other people who are going to be involved in both. So having the ability to incorporate these people seamlessly, bring in the tooling to facilitate the communications and also keep the communications in context, right? Email is not a great way to do that. If you're running 3, 4, 5 RFPs, everything's going to the same inbox, and you have to constantly context shift. So you don't want to do that. You want to keep all the context together. And then lastly is the data wrangling problem. Taking all the data and presenting it in such a way where it's, on the issuing side, right, easy to build and see what it is you're building and what it is you're asking, and having, internal transparency around things like weighting and priorities. And then on the other side, when the responses come back, being able to do an apples to apples comparison and score these. Now, the way we do the scoring for what it's worth is blind. And I think that's a nice to have, meaning you don't know which vendor you're responding to, because again, we want to maximize the integrity of the process. But if you can do without that, I think that's a nice to have. But I think the need to have is repeatable process, communication tools, contextually rooted communications tools, and engagement tools, and then and data wrangling.
So just to summarize, and I agree, one is repeatable process. The value of repeatable process is efficiency and improvement. If I do the same, it's just like tying your shoes. Teaching your kids to tie their shoes the first time is very clumsy and very difficult, and a lot of thought process and explaining, and then you do it again, they get better, faster. And now today, you and I, we don't even think about tying our shoes, it just happens. And that's the same thing when you look at an RFP process, is that the more you do it, the better you get at it, the more efficient it becomes, the better you get at using the tools. And the tools allow you to have a repeatable process, enable that collaboration, which I think is a key element to the RFP, is having the right people giving you input, the vendors participating, the evaluation process. That blind evaluation, helps keep conflicts of interest out of it due to marketing that's going on or knowing different stuff. So that collaboration is important. And the data management, from keeping the data in a secure environment, which we'll talk about in the next question, because that's one of the big ones that a lot of people are concerned about. And then having it reportable, because we have to be able to report to the stakeholders where we are in this process. How did we award this contract? So they can see how we did it. And then even stakeholders up into the executive level. What's driving our decisions, and how are we saving money? And does this align with our corporate vision? And then they can go into the system and they can see everything that's going on. But going into the final question, and then for those that are listening, come up with your own questions and start typing those in so we can respond to them. Just look to your right. There's a question mark. You can just click that, type in your question, and then we'll talk about that. But cloud technology is all the rage right now. I mean, if you're not in the cloud, you're not cool, right? But then the fear is security. And with companies, large companies, small companies, even startups, proprietary information and protecting that information is an issue. How do we protect that? How can an RFP tool, when you put it in the cloud, how do I know my data is secure? How do I know that the bad guys aren't looking at my stuff and stealing it for themselves? Do you have any thoughts on that? Is there a way for us to look for that?
Sure. I mean, I think what you want to do, the cloud, for all the concerns people have about security, I bank on the cloud. There's a lot of information on the cloud, and I think we're generally pretty safe. People want to steal my identity. There are loads of ways to do it. The cloud is one way they could presumably do it, but there are loads of other ways to do it. Having said that, you want to check some boxes. So the questions you want to ask. Is if you're in what's called a multi-tenant environment. A multi-tenant environment means, if anybody here is like a Gmail user, right? Everybody logs into the same Gmail service. So how is the data basically isolated, from one user to the next? I log in, my wife and I both use Gmail. I cannot see her Gmail account when I log in. She can't see mine when she logs in. And so how do you segment the data? And that's what we call a logical segmentation of the data, because physically it might reside on the same server, the same infrastructure. And that would be number one. Number two, you are going to want to ask about encryption in transit. That means is if you're sending this stuff over the cloud, is the data, when it's being sent from point A to point B, is that being encrypted? And the answer should be yes. You can ask questions about the kinds of encryption, et cetera. And then lastly, is it going to be encrypted at rest? So after it's gone over the wire, right, it's landed on the cloud server. If that server is compromised, what happens? Can people get at the data? If the data is encrypted at rest, then it doesn't matter so much if somebody gets at it. If they can't decrypt it, which is a whole level of complexity beyond getting into the server, they're basically going to be looking at gobbledygook. So those are the primary things. And then from a legal standpoint, and to the extent that your questionnaire, your criteria are IP, you're going to want to execute non-disclosure agreements with the vendors. Good tool should probably support that natively. But if it doesn't, you can execute an NDA separate and apart from your RFP, and then only choose to invite the vendors who have agreed to the NDA, and you make it clear to them that the RFP is bound by that NDA.
So it's not just technology, but then you want to put some legal compliance things in place that you can make part of your RFP process to ensure you've done everything possible to secure the process using secure servers, using a company that talks about that and ensures and proves it to you. And then in our own process, make sure that we sign our NDAs with our vendors so they don't disclose anything they should not be disclosing. And that, just to add to that, as an RFP creator, make sure one of the instructions you include in your RFP is that do not include any proprietary information that you don't want to be compromised, or clearly, no, it's not do not include it, but clearly identify proprietary information. This is more for our public procurement professionals than our private ones, but the public side, because you have this thing called FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, that you can ask for that information on that RFP. So clearly identify what is proprietary, put it in a special section, a special footnote, whatever it is, so that if it is requested, it can be protected in that stuff. So, well, good.
Can I have one quick comment?
Yeah.
For all the, because we do hear, concerns about cloud. And oftentimes the question is, well, how are you currently doing this? And they say, well, we email Microsoft Word documents around. That is less secure than using cloud. That is typically going to be all unencrypted in transit and all unencrypted at rest. And then beyond that, right, it's already packaged up in such a way that somebody could easily disseminate it. So you have to assess currently, like what your existing security standpoint is before you even start thinking about the implications of moving to a new system.
Okay. We actually have a question that talks about some of what we're discussing at this point. But just to kind of summarize where we're at, is that we've gone through several questions, and now this is the time for the audience to share with us their thoughts, their questions, their concerns about RFP tools and RFP systems. And we have one question here. It says, it's from Susan. It says, I'm working on a big RFP using a third-party eRFX tool. I found several suppliers are very reluctant to use the tool or just refuse to use the tool. We even held a training session. How can I get the suppliers to actually use the tool? So this is kind of a great question. A lot of what we talked about, one, not only the procurement professionals using the tools they've been given by these huge ERP systems, but now you got the vendors refusing to play. So, David, what are your thoughts? How do we get parties to play, both sides, in the systems, the tools we want to use to make our life easier? What are some of your thoughts there?
So it's a good question. It certainly does not jive with our experience, where we see close to 100% of invited vendors who don't have accounts create accounts. But it certainly is a real issue. I expect we will run into it at some point in time. I would say, the comment I made about smoke signals is true. If it's a big enough RFP, for the most part, salespeople want to get fed, and so they will agree to play ball. Now, if we go back to the question earlier about who controls the process, and the buyer controls the process, and the buyer has has some responsibility to the seller to make this thing appealing. You could ask your eRFP vendor if there's a capability to effectively export the eRFP to maybe an Excel format or something, and then a subsequent import on the other end. And what this would allow the vendor to do would be to use Excel. Presumably they're comfortable using that. Complete the RFP, and then maybe send that back to you, and then you can import it. Or if that capability isn't in there, maybe your eRFX vendor could actually act as the go-between, execute an NDA, and then basically manage that process for you on the back end. So when you log in to do your evaluation, you'll see everything.
I would offer that, one, if you have an ERP tool, ERPFX thing, that you're combining two purposes. You have an enterprise resource tool that's managing many different facets of your business, and now you try to say, okay, I want this one huge tool to work on this one little thing for me, RFPs. versus a tool specifically for RFPs. So that may be where the suppliers start to feel that frustration, is that you're asking me for a lot of information that you really don't need right now until we win the business. So, keep RFPs focused on RFPs and have a tool specifically for RFPs that enable you to do that. And probably then we want to ask our RFP solutions, can they integrate with larger solutions? That would probably be another key feature that maybe we didn't talk about earlier when we look at RFP tools. Can that tool integrate with what I'm already doing so that I don't have to replace anything? I can only add value to what I currently have. So, that's something to consider as well. Okay, we have another comment. That basically what happened. I downloaded the Excel and they sent it back to me. Took a lot of my time. So Susan, she had where she basically did what you shared with us, David. She said, she did the Excel spreadsheet. She did that. It just took a lot of her time. And there's probably two pieces to this, not only technology, but also training, which we did. But then, like I like to say a lot of times, if your supplier's having supply chain problems, you're having supply chain problems. And this is where a point where your suppliers don't understand supply chain as a capability. They understand it as something they've got to do. And so they need to get more into this process, RFP process.
I would actually be curious, Susan, if you're still with us, to know if you could provide some color around the specific objections. If it's free for the supplier to create an account and participate, I can't say whether or not it's a better or worse experience. I don't know the tooling question. But I wonder why they wouldn't do it, for a free account. If there's a fee for them to do this, okay, I could understand. But I'm just curious because they're going to be entering the same information into Excel that they would be entering into any other tool. So can you give some color on that?
While Susan's typing, Susan, can you give us a little context of what were the objections from the vendors? I know my experience working with a particular RFP tool or eRFP tool is not only did I have to put in all my company information, but then they started digging into financial information and payment information and a whole bunch of other things that, in my opinion, at the moment, we weren't there yet. We weren't even to an RFP. I was just setting up to get into the system, not even participating in an RFP yet. And they were asking me for all this information and that was giving the system access to information that they could use for other things, but that's where maybe I wasn't comfortable. So Susan provided some context here, and she said some said we're not allowed per their corporate policy. Some were afraid of the technology. So that goes to kind of what we were talking about before, is the fear of putting information in places that they don't see or control or know where it's going. So that may be something I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I would say, Susan, I would go back to the platform vendor. If you're running into this, with any regularity, and I'd say, I want you to build me an automated experience whereby it can be exported. The vendor can fill it out. They can send it to me, and I can import it. I mean, it's a little bit silly because at the end of the day, right? If you're entering all the data back into the tool, it's going to be in the tool anyway, right? The only thing the vendor is doing is not entering it, himself or herself. It doesn't, prevent the data from getting into the tool. So, yeah, you might want to even tell that to the vendor. Like, if you're going to be participating, this is the evaluation tool that we're using. It's going to get in there one way or the other. I can do it or you can do it. You certainly should not have to bear the burden of manually copying and pasting all that stuff into the tool. To the extent that there's an issue, we haven't built this into our tool, bluntly, but if we had occasions where people were saying, look, that's just not happening, we would build an automated process whereby vendor clicks to export, vendor fills it out, vendor sends it to buyer clicks upload, and it gets, everything gets done automatically.
Susan said several didn't understand my company still own the data, not the third party. So this may be actually a requirement dealing with proprietary information that just needs to be handled in a different way. And Susan, what we can do is we'll reach back out to you after this webinar to kind of talk more specifically about your problem to see how we can solve that, because I think it's a combination not only of technology, but technology process, and then vendors better understanding how this works, and then just addressing their fears directly, and just work with them to do that. So so great question, Susan. This you actually validated our entire conversation today in regards to challenges with vendors, data, system complexity, making it simple, making it work all together in a way that just makes sense for people. So, thank you for that question. And we'll reach back out to you to get more information about what's going on. But just to wrap it up today, everyone, we're about 10 minutes over, so I want to go ahead and wrap it up in that, some of the things to consider. What are your next steps from here today? Is one, consider that our reality here is that we're negotiating, we are frustrated, we're always kind of stumbling over people to get where we need to go for RFPs. And, and what we've done, here, think about Amazon's using the RFP process for their new headquarters. You can look up Amazon RFP HQ, and you can see everything they're doing. And you have major cities participating in an RFP process to win that headquarters business. So if Amazon's doing it, what do you think you should be doing? If do you ignore the value of the RFP process to understand it and understand the tools that you use for the RFP, or do you buckle down and master this process with the appropriate tools so that you can consistently and effectively and efficiently do RFPs day in and day out in a way that continuously generates more profit for your company? Now, the solution for you today is to master the RFP process. This is a training we put together. Okay, it goes through the entire RFP process, and there's more in-depth, detailed analysis in this training. And so it's online. It gives you 24/7 access. It's 6 courses or 6 lessons, about an hour each. So if you want to learn more about that, go ahead and go to cpsmtraining.com, master the fundamentals of RFPs. Just go right there. You'll see where it is. You can learn more about it in a quick video, and then click to enroll. It's not very expensive. It's something at this point, what we want to do is make sure you understand the RFP process, and then we can look at more tools. And as I mentioned before, we're starting to build this RFX Academy where it's going to enable you as procurement professionals start to build out a capability that makes you more valuable for your current organization and potentially your vendors and even your outside network, because you're going to be able to take what you know as an expert and apply it to many different situations. Many different situations. So with that, thank you for your time today. I know you've been busy. We have a few more questions, and we'll reach out to those as we're kind of wrapping up, and we will be good to go. So thank you for your time. Anything else, just reach out to me at info@cpsmtraining.com. Again, info@cpsmtraining.com, and we will be able to take care of you. Talk with you soon. Have a wonderful day. Take care.